It is time for my monthly inflation report, and as always, we go to my familiar 3-parameter matrix. And longtime viewers know why I have a 3-parameter matrix, in order to get a very holistic assessment of inflation and to nullify any accusations that the inflation indices are rigged or not fully representative or anything like that. So we have the 10-year compound annual growth rate of the U.S. CPI, which is U.S. only, but the U.S. is the world's largest economy, of course. We have the 10-year compound annual growth rate of the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, which is the most important of the three measurements, because the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index simultaneously is worldwide. It comprises of freely traded commodities, so that utterly nullifies any claim that the index is rigged or that inflation is understated. And best of all, commodity price inflation versus deflation is unambiguous about whether inflation is good and deflation is bad and things of that nature. Most people are very confused about that because they think any price rise is bad, including in the stock market, and therefore they preclude any scenario in which anyone's actually making money. The reason the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index gets around all that is by looking only at commodities. Commodities have little or no labor cost component in commodity prices, therefore commodity prices dropping is unambiguously good, and commodity prices rising is unambiguously bad. And any nuance beyond that is way too complicated for most people, because when there's service price inflation, yes, the customer of the service is paying more, but that's simultaneous with a wage increase of the service provider. Person A sells a service to person B. Person B complains about inflation. Person A is making more, but if person B sells a service to person C, and the price of that service rose, then person B is also making more from service price increases, yet they don't count that as inflation because far too many people are being trained to whine about everything, no matter how illogical or mathematically unsound it is. And finally, the 10-year U.S. Treasury yield, which is more an indicator of expected future inflation, but it has a tremendous effect on home prices as well as U.S. government spending and national debt interest serviceability, which we'll talk about later in this video as well. Now, each month I do this video, I have to decide whether to go through each one of these with the source websites explained in detail each time, versus a decision not to bore the longtime viewers who have seen this in each of the last 12 months I have done this monthly update. So this time I'm going to elect to skip going to each of these websites. The links are in the description box below, and if you need an explanation for each of the 3 websites, you can see the parameters discussed in prior month videos, of which there are several on this channel. So going directly to the results, the 10-year compound annual growth rate of the US CPI is 2.8%, which is below 3%. The 10-year compound annual growth rate of the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index is minus 1.26%. Deflation. The price of commodities is in deflation. The record high of oil prices was in 2008. That was 16 years ago. Since that time, the amount of oil consumed by the global economy has fallen by 80% as a percentage of the total economy. Not in total dollars consumed, but oil consumption as a percentage of the total economy has fallen by close to 80% since the peak in 2008. And then the 10-year U.S. Treasury yield is 4.475%. Again, the links to this are in the description box below. And today on May 23rd, 2024, you can verify that these are the correct numbers for each of these 3. Now we'll go to a table that gets into more detail about this US CPI because that will provide other further clarity. In this table, we have the inflation readings of the US CPI for short-term durations, 1 month, 2 month, 3 month, and 6 month, and then what that annualizes to. So a 1-month inflation reading has to be taken to the 12th power. A 2-month inflation reading has to be taken to the 6th power. 3 month has to be taken to the 4th power because 3 months times 4 is 12 months. 6 month has to be taken to the square, and then 1 year is straight, and we get this annualized CPI again to see whether there is any indication of the number rising or falling. And then longer than 1 year, we have 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and 10 years. In 2 years, the inflation was 7.2%, but that's only 3.5% a year. 3 years, 16.8%, but the third root of that means 5.3% a year. For 5 years, it was 4.2% a year, but the number that we want is the 10-year window because that is long enough to smooth out any noise, and that is still only 2.8% a year. And just for further clarity, I include the entirety of the 21st century since January 1st, 2001. The CPI rose 78.9%. And the unsophisticated will say, that's a huge amount of inflation, 78.9% in the 21st century alone. But per year, that is 2.5% a year. but the 10-year reading is only 2.8% a year. It could go above 3% because these more recent readings are still a little bit hotter than normal. And we're going to explain why that is and why this 5-year reading sheds some light on what is going on, because that encompasses the entire COVID-19 period and all the money printing associated with that. So let me go to Wikipedia to look at the U.S. federal budget. This is the United States federal budget as per Wikipedia, and I want to scroll down to see what individual budgets were for individual calendar years and what the trend of increase for that was. So in 2000, it was 1.8 trillion, technically 1.85 trillion if you go to the second decimal. We could start with 2000, that's as good of a starting point as any. Almost every American, whether left or right of center, will say that 2000 was when the social fabric and the value that citizens got from their government was overall better than it is today, even if the technology of today is so much more advanced than before. And by 2019, this 1.8 trillion had risen to 4.4 trillion. So 4.4 trillion is not low by any means, but at least it took 19 years to go from 1.85 trillion to 4.4 trillion. In the next slide, we'll look at what the annualized percentage growth rate of that meant. But then COVID-19 happened, and as they say in the big government uniparty, never let a crisis go to waste, they expanded government spending incredibly, with some assistance from the Federal Reserve buying treasuries, thereby enabling huge deficit spending. And now they don't really want to shrink it down. So in 2024, we are at 6.9 trillion. Even though it went down from 2021 to 6.3, 6.1, that would lead us to think there should be a 5-point-something number in 2024. But now it is 6.9 trillion. Why? Because the uniparty wants to buy votes for the uniparty candidate. I won't even say Democrat or Republican, because most establishment Republicans are fully on board with this and are receiving kickbacks for this. 4.4 went to 6.9 trillion in just 5 years, and we are now expected to believe that this is normal and should be the new status quo. Let's go to the next slide to see some more clarity here. So as we saw, 1.85 trillion was the US federal budget in 2000. And remember, that's when we did not have a deficit. We even had a small surplus at that time. So the US federal government only spent as much as it collected in taxes. By 2019, it rose to 4.4 trillion, which is more than the inflation rate over that time, but still 4.7% of a year increase. Higher than ideal, but not truly out of control. 4.4 trillion. But yet from this already high number, we are now at 6.9 trillion, which means a 57% gain in just 5 fiscal years. The fiscal year is not exactly the same as the calendar year, but for simplicity, we're going with that fiscal year as designated in each official budget. 57% gain, which is 9.4% a year. That's twice the annual rate of gain as this 4.7% a year. So 1.85 trillion in the year 2000, which is not that long ago. Many of you watching are old enough to remember the year 2000. It was only 1.85 trillion a year. This did not increase at the rate of the US CPI, which was the only rate of increase that should have been allowed, but it's increased at a much faster rate than that, and now it's 6.9 trillion in 2024, including a 9.4% a year gain in the last 5 years. Now, this is one of the places where you do not want to see an exponential growth rate. Just like you don't want to see an exponential growth rate in the size of a cancer tumor, you do not want to see an exponential growth rate here, because we are not getting better value for our money in terms of government spending. And why did it have to rise from 2023 to 2024? COVID-19 is over. But the uniparty is buying votes by bribing people with student loan forgiveness and other welfare and a whole bunch of other one-off type payments to force people to vote for the uniparty candidate. And remember, most Republicans are in on this as well. This is extremely bad, but it is also a confirmation of technological deflation, because if government spending can rise 9.4% a year, yet CPI inflation over the last 5 years was just 4.2% a year, as we saw, that means technological deflation is for real, as further corroborated by this additional measurement. Now, this is a waste of a very, very valuable buffer the United States had. In the 1990s, it was believed that when the U.S. national debt, which is the cumulative amount of U.S. budget spending ahead of taxes collected, or the cumulative budget deficit stacked onto each prior year's deficit for a grand total, it was believed that when that reached 100% of U.S. GDP, that would be a disaster. Lo and behold, because of the accelerating rate of change and exponential economic growth, 100% of GDP was not a problem. That was crossed around here. But now it is much more than that. Now it is 125, 130, 135% of U.S. GDP. So they really are intent on testing what the real limit is, and we have squandered this safety buffer, this surprise safety buffer that most people didn't know that we had, and it should have been kept for a real crisis. It has instead been squandered in government graft and corruption. I have a lot of videos on this channel about how the scope creep of government obstructs all human progress, as you can see in this tag in the upper right hand corner, and another video about how the two-party system is guaranteed for failure for reasons that were very predictable. You can see that video in this tag up here in the upper right hand corner. But this is where you don't want to see exponential growth, because it also means that the government is drawing away valuable life energy from the private sector where it could in fact uplift the human condition. The growth of government is much faster than the growth of the rest of the economy at this rate, and this is not crisis level spending, because then it should have been ramped back down. If 2019 was 4.4 trillion, then 2024 could be a little more, 4.8 trillion maybe, 4.9 trillion, but not 6.9 trillion. This is now kicking into a steeper growth trajectory, that too based only on corruption. Now, if you like this type of content, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel, and thank you very much for watching.